They didn't expect much from a bankrupt veteran and a half-lame cavalry horse. But when Ethan Cole drove into the snowy Montana wilderness with nothing but a rusted toolbox and a scarred Mustang named Valor, something unexpected began to happen. What started as survival in a crumbling border outpost turned into a quiet revolution of wood memory and firelight. He wasn't building a cabin. He was building a second chance. And by the time spring melted the snow, what rose from the ruins would leave everyone, his children, his neighbors, even himself, speechless. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The apartment didn't look like a home anymore. The beige carpet was gone, stripped down to bare wooden planks that showed dust in the grooves. The walls were naked, no pictures, no shelves, just faint rectangles where sunlight had once faded the paint around framed photos. In the corner near the sliding balcony door, a single cardboard box sat like an orphan, sealed with worn packing tape, labeled in thick black marker, MISC. Keep. Inside were papers that didn't matter to anyone but him. 2 cracked picture frames and a rolled-up bridle that smelled faintly of oiled leather. On the kitchen counter, next to an empty coffee mug, lay the letter. Final notice. Eviction effective immediately. The words might as well have been carved into stone. He'd read them a dozen times since yesterday, though the meaning never changed. This was it. The last line had been drawn, and he'd been pushed over it. Ethan Cole stood in the middle of the empty living room, the late afternoon light bleeding in through dusty blinds, slicing shadows across his face. At 52, he was tall, but lean, his shoulders still carrying the faint stiffness of military posture. His hair, once black, was silvering fast at the temples. The navy blue field jacket he wore was frayed at the cuffs, the patches long gone, but the faint outline of their shape still ghosted the fabric. It wasn't just the apartment that felt hollow. Something inside him was empty too, something that had been leaking away for years. The house was gone. The marriage had been signed away in a courthouse 3 years ago. The steady job repairing agricultural equipment gone in the downturn. And whatever compass used to point him forward had been left somewhere overseas in a desert he still dreamed about more than he cared to admit. Through the grimy window down in the cracked asphalt parking lot, his last real companion waited. Valor stood tied to a lamppost, head-high, ears turning at every sound. The big Mustang's coat was a deep chestnut, darkened almost to mahogany, the late sunlight catching the edges of his mane. His posture was calm, the way it always was, solid-rooted. Once years ago, Valor had been a cavalry training mount at Fort Carson, Colorado. Ethan had worked with him when the Army was running mounted patrol exercises. They'd aged together in a way both built for work no one seemed to need anymore. The old saddle hung over the tailgate of Ethan's battered pickup. The leather straps were cracked and smelled faintly of dust and sweat. He could almost hear the rhythmic jangle of metal buckles in the wind, the sound that had been the backdrop to long, slow rides under a desert sun. He murmured to himself, voice barely audible in the quiet, "Just you and me now, huh?" Valor turned his head at the sound, nostrils flaring. He stamped a hoof once, twice, a low, steady thump against the pavement. Not nervous, just present. Like a man acknowledging he'd been spoken to. Ethan packed the last box with deliberate slowness. There was no point in hurrying. He had nowhere to be, not really. But every movement felt like closing the cover on a book he wasn't ready to stop reading. On the counter sat one last photo, still in its frame. Him, Sarah, and the kids Maya, with missing front teeth. Luke barely old enough to stand without wobbling. They were in a park, somewhere, fall leaves in the background, a picnic blanket on the grass. His arm was around Sarah's shoulder. She'd been smiling at him when the shutter clicked. He hesitated, thumb running along the edge of the frame. Then he slipped it into the box between a stack of envelopes and the bridle. The apartment felt heavier when it was empty. He turned once, scanning the bare walls, and for a moment he could hear echoes of laughter, Maya shrieking as Luke chased her, Sarah calling them in for dinner. But the sound was only in his head. He locked the door behind him, the metallic click ringing loud in the hallway. He didn't look back. The pickup's engine coughed to life on the second try. Ethan eased it out of the parking lot, so the small U-Haul trailer clanking behind. Valor shifted his weight in the trailer, the wooden floor creaking. He took the on-ramp to Highway 93 and pointed the nose northwest. The city bled away fast, replaced by low pines and the first slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was mid-autumn. The trees had thinned their leaves long gone, and the wind off the higher peaks carried the first promise of winter. He didn't know exactly where he was going. Somewhere out toward the Lolo National Forest, he remembered there was an abandoned border outpost, a weathered pile of timber that had once been manned by a few men like him, watching a stretch of nothing for signs of trouble that never came. His father had mentioned it once in one of his quieter moods, saying it had good bones. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was a place without people. And that was what Ethan needed, a place to vanish or to figure out if starting over was even worth trying. The radio sputtered between stations. He switched it off. The only sound left was the hum of the engine and the low rattle of the trailer hitch. The first warning came with a smell oil and hot dust. Then, as the road curved along a cliffside, it hit the sharp metallic crack of an explosion from somewhere ahead. It was probably just a construction crew blasting rock for a new retaining wall. But Ethan's mind didn't know that. In an instant, the pavement under his tires wasn't pavement anymore. It was sun-baked dirt. The air was thicker, hotter. Dust stung his eyes. The low hum of his engine became the roar of an armored Humvee. Someone was shouting orders, but the words were drowned out by the crack of rifle fire in the distance. His chest tightened. His hands clamped around the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. A cold sweat broke along his neck, and his heartbeat slammed in his ears, hard enough to shake the edges of his vision. The curve of the mountain road ahead was gone. In its place was the jagged outline of a walled compound, and somewhere inside the sound of boots pounding on packed sand. A short, sharp sound cut through the haze. From behind him, through the thin metal of the trailer walls, came Valor's whinny brief, almost impatient. Then the solid thunk of a hoof striking wood, steady and measured. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound Ethan had heard hundreds of times during formation drills. The rhythm was exact, as if the horse was marching in place. He latched onto it, focusing on each beat. Thump, inhale, thump, exhale. The sand under his boots became asphalt again. The shouting faded. The rifle cracks thinned to nothing. All that was left was the wind over the cab and the smell of pine somewhere up ahead. His grip eased on the steering wheel. He pulled the truck onto the gravel's shoulder, put it in park, and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. For a long moment, he stayed there, forehead resting against the cool rim of the steering wheel. His breathing slowed. The sweat on his neck began to dry. When he finally stepped out, the air was sharp, with altitude cold enough to bite at his cheeks. He walked back to the trailer, boots crunching on loose rock. Valor's head was visible over the half-door ears, forward eyes calm. Ethan set a hand on the horse's warm neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the skin. "Good job, partner," he murmured. "I'm still here. Thanks to you." Valor didn't move, except for a slow blink, and the kind that always made Ethan think the horse understood more than he let on. The road ahead stretched into the shadow of the mountains, its curves disappearing into the trees. Somewhere past those ridges, an empty outpost waited. He climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and let the truck roll forward. This time, he kept the window cracked so the sound of steady hoofbeats could find him if he needed it again. The road narrowed without warning. After nearly 6 hours behind the wheel, half of it winding through switchbacks, Ethan eased the pickup onto a rutted dirt track that looked like it hadn't seen a county grader in decades. Grass grew high down the center, the kind that whispered against the undercarriage. The tire marks ahead were faint bleached gray by sun and rain. 100 yards and a wooden gate leaned drunkenly across the path. The sign nailed to it was little more than splinters now, the paint worn to a ghost of itself. Up close, the stenciled letters could still be made out if you knew what to look for. West Forest Service. Lookout Station 9. Ethan stepped out into the cool air, boots sinking in the soft dirt. He put a hand on the gate, tested it. The crossbeam all but sagged in his grip, one end already hanging free of its post. A push was all it took to knock it aside. Back in the cab, he drove on slowly, letting the pickup crawl over loose stones. The road twisted through a narrow corridor of pines, their trunks thick with moss. Every so often, a granite boulder jutted from the slope, its surface damp and green. The air here had a weight to it, cooler laced with the smell of wet needles, and something faintly metallic like rain, even though the sky was dry. The forest broke open into a clearing, and there it was. Lookout Station 9 squatted in the center of the space like a forgotten chess piece. Time had pulled at it from every angle. To the left stood a cluster of log buildings, small single-story, their siding bleached gray. The largest had a porch missing half its boards, the front steps sagging. Beyond them, a skeletal watchtower rose 3 stories into the air, its steel frame streaked orange with rust. The ladder leading up to the first platform was missing 3 rungs. At the top, the cabin's metal roof listed to one side, and a loose vent flap banged gently in the wind, clank, clank, clank. Off to the right, closer to the tree line, was a horse barn, or what was left of one. The entire left side of its roof had caved in, scattering cedar shingles across the ground. One of the stall doors had fallen off its hinges and lay half buried in weeds. The paint was long gone, replaced by splinters and rot. The air around it carried the faint, sour smell of old hay gone to mold, mixed with the ghost of manure from animals long gone. It was the kind of place you could almost hear, if you stood still enough, the murmur of voices long since gone silent and the ring of hammer-on. Nail the snort of a horse in its stall. But those sounds belonged to another decade, maybe another lifetime. Ethan killed the engine and got out, letting the door swing shut behind him. The breeze moved through the pines with a low hiss tugging at the hem of his jacket. He stood there a long while, just looking. He didn't need to think about the decision. With a low sigh, he walked back to the trailer, unlatched the ramp, and stepped aside. Valor backed out with the slow confidence of a horse who'd done this hundreds of times. He lifted his head, nostrils, flaring ears, twitching toward every creak and rustle in the clearing. There was no fear in him, only alertness. Not much to look at, Ethan said under his breath, running a hand down the horse's neck. But it's got a roof, more or less. He glanced around. To someone else's eyes, this would be wreckage. To his, it was not quite a beginning, but a pause. A place to catch his breath. The gas tank was low. His cash was lower. And beyond this point, there wasn't anywhere else to go. He'd stay, at least for now. The smallest of the main buildings still had 4 walls standing, and a roof mostly intact. That made it the winner by default. The door groaned in protest. When he pushed it open, the hinges shrieking. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint, sharp tang of rodent droppings. Spiderwebs draped from the ceiling to the tops of overturned chairs, their legs splayed like dead insects. A drift of brittle leaves had gathered in one corner. Ethan propped the door with a scrap of wood and spent the next hour sweeping out what he could: webs, leaves, the desiccated body of a squirrel curled in the ash pan of the cold stove. 2 of the 4 front windows were smashed, jagged edges still in the frames. He nailed pieces of warped plywood over them, more to keep out the wind than anything else. From the truck, he brought in his old sleeping pad, unrolled it in the center of the floor, and spread his sleeping bag on top. The cast iron stove in the corner was rusted to a dull orange, its vent pipe loose where it met the wall. It could work again, given tools and time. Valor's stall took longer. He found one section of the barn where the roof still held. The post at the corner was solid enough to tie him off. From what was left of a hayloft, Ethan pulled down an armful of dry grass, not much, but enough for the night, and scattered it over the floor. He ran a hand through the horse's mane. "We'll start from here," he said quietly. Day 1, darkness came fast in the mountains. By the time he'd stowed his gear and buttoned the trailer, the light in the clearing was thin and blue, and the first stars were out. The wind coming down from the ridge rattled the loose metal on the tower, making a hollow, almost human sound. Inside the cabin, the cold came in like water under a door, slow at first, then all at once. He sat on the sleeping bag in his jacket, arms wrapped around himself. Without power, there was no light, but the dull orange from his battery lantern. And no sound, but the occasional pop of a branch breaking somewhere in the trees. It wasn't the same kind of dark as the city. This dark was thick, complete, wrapping the building in something you could almost feel on your skin. The smell of the floorboards rose with the temperature-drop mildew and old sap. Somewhere behind it was the wilder scent of pine and earth, of a place that had not been tamed in a long time. Sleep came slowly in uneasy stretches. When it did, it brought the desert with it. Heat pressed down from a sky the color of brass. Somewhere behind him, men were shouting urgent, overlapping, impossible to follow. The ground shuddered under distant concussions. He could taste grit in his mouth. His rifle was heavy in his hands, but when he tried to raise it, his arms felt like lead. He opened his mouth to call for air support, but the sound came out wrong, thin and dry, then gone altogether. His vision swam. The world tilted. Somewhere in the chaos, a new sound began to cut through. Slow, rhythmic, thok, thok, thok. Not gunfire, not boots, hooves. He turned toward it, or thought he did, and for a moment the world seemed to fold in on itself, the blistering desert narrowing down to the steady beat of a single horse's weight, shifting on wood. The dream dissolved. Ethan jolted upright in the sleeping bag, heart-pounding breath tearing in and out. The cabin was black as ink, and the only light a pale ribbon of moon through the high, unbroken window. His ears strained for the sound again. It was there outside, a gentle scraping like the edge of a hoof, drawing across rough planks. He pushed himself up, found his boots by feel, and stepped out into the cold. The clearing was silvered with frost, the trees around it motionless in the still air. Valor stood in his stall, head over the rail, one foreleg shifting just enough to make that sound again. His eyes caught the moonlight, steady and dark. Ethan walked up, laid his forehead against the warm crest of the horse's neck. His breath clouded between them. "You're still keeping me awake," he whispered. "Good job." For a while, he just stood there, listening to the slow rhythm of the animals breathing. Above them, the wind stirred in the watchtower, but it no longer sounded like something broken. The cold was the first thing he felt. Ethan came awake to the sharp bite of air slipping through the gaps in the cabin's warped door. The smell of damp wood hung heavy-laced with the faint tang of smoke from the fire he'd kept going until late the night before. Somewhere outside, Valor let out a soft, low whinny, a sound that managed to be both a greeting and a nudge to get moving. He pushed himself upright, joints stiff from the hard floor, and shrugged into his jacket. Outside, frost tipped the edges of the grass, and the clearing lay silent under a pale, washed-out sky. He crouched beside the small ring of stones he'd built for a fire pit, stacking the handful of dry branches he'd gathered yesterday. The kindling caught with a reluctant crackle, sending up a thin ribbon of smoke that spiraled toward the bare crown of the watchtower. A gust funneled down from the ridge, threading through the gaps in the barn siding, bringing with it the sense of pine sap and the darker, earthier smell of wet moss. Ethan hunched closer to the flames, waiting for the water in the blackened pot to come to a boil. That was when he heard it, the distant hum of an engine. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but it grew steadily louder. Vehicles didn't just arrive out here. Not unless they meant to. He turned his head toward the tree line, squinting through the thin morning light. A red pickup rolled into view, its tires crunching over the frost-stiffened dirt. It slowed to a stop just inside the gate, and a man in a navy blue jacket and cap climbed out. The Postal Service logo was stitched over his breast pocket. He had a small stack of envelopes in one hand. "Morning," the man called, his breath visible in the air. "Saw your name got forwarded out here. Wasn't far off my route, figured I'd drop 'em by." Ethan stood brushing ash from his hands and gave a short nod. "Appreciate it." The postman crossed the clearing, handed over the stack without ceremony, and headed back toward his truck. By the time Ethan muttered a thank you, the door was already closing, and the pickup was turning down the trail taillights, flashing briefly in the gloom before vanishing into the trees. There were 3 envelopes. 2 were thin, windowed bills, the kind that needed nothing more than a grimace before being shoved aside. The 3rd was heavier stock, its cream-colored surface smooth under his thumb. The handwriting on the front tugged at something in his chest, familiar, in a way that made his fingers hesitate. He sat down on the porch's splintered steps, the wood cold through his jeans, and slit the flap with his thumb. The words spilled out in looping cursive across a card thick enough to stand on its own. "Sarah and Michael. We're getting married." The inside was printed in neat italics. "You are warmly invited." His eyes stopped there. He didn't read the date or the location or the little paragraph about how wonderful it would be to see him. The air seemed thinner all of a sudden, as if the pines around the clearing had pulled closer, blocking out the sky. Her face came back to him, not as she might look now, smiling in some new kitchen sunlight on her hair, but as she'd been in the years before she left. Laughing over a pot on the stove, while the kids chased each other through the hall. Sitting with him on the porch in the evenings, her head resting lightly against his shoulder while Valor grazed in the pasture. Those rare nights when sleep wouldn't come, and she would just sit beside him, saying nothing, letting him know she was there. He remembered her eyes the last year of their marriage. Not angry, not accusing, just tired. The kind of tired that seeps into the bones. "You're not the man I married anymore," she'd said once. "You're still here, but you're not here." Now she'd moved on, officially, publicly, and he was still exactly where she'd left him, if not in the same place, then in the same state of being. Alone, between the trees, between the ghosts. Ethan set the card down beside him on the step, stared at it for a long time, then pushed himself to his feet. "Work," he muttered. Just work. Valor's stall was his first stop. The horse was waiting, but something in his stance was different. His ears twitched forward as Ethan approached, and he shifted his weight toward the far corner. His right foreleg pawed once-twice at the wall, the sound a hollow thunk against the weathered boards. "What's your deal?" Ethan stepped into the stall feed bucket in hand. Valor's hoof struck again, this time square on a panel in the wall. The plank trembled faintly under the impact. Ethan frowned, setting the bucket down. When he pressed his palm to it, the wood gave ever so slightly, as if it wasn't fully fastened to the frame. Before he could step back, Valor swung his head and nudged the spot hard with his muzzle. The board gave way with a sharp crack, falling forward into Ethan's arms in a burst of dust. Behind it was a shallow cavity no bigger than a suitcase. The smell of old timber and cobwebs rushed out. Something sat inside, metal by the dull glint of it. The box was about the size of a bread loaf. Its corners rounded the surface, mottled with rust. A simple latch held it shut, but years of corrosion had fused it in place. Ethan took his pocket knife from his belt and worked the blade under the clasp until it finally gave with a squeal of protest. The lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in a faded strip of canvas, were three things. A small leather-bound notebook, the cover cracked and softened with age. A bronze medal in a tarnished presentation case, U.S. Army Commendation Medal. And a black and white photograph of a man standing in front of the very watchtower that loomed over the clearing now. The man's uniform was pressed, his boots shined, his posture ramrod straight. The set of his jaw was the same as the mountains behind him, unyielding. Ethan picked up the notebook. The leather was cool to the touch, the pages edged with a faint yellow. The first line inside was written in blocky, deliberate handwriting, CPT, George Harris. Lookout Station 9, 1967. The entries were short, precise. Not the confessions of a lonely man, but the records of someone who knew that words carried weight. A watchman doesn't just guard the land, he guards himself against the emptiness. Not everyone will understand why we stay, but we understand. And that's enough. Ethan traced the lines with his thumb. Whoever Harris had been, he'd known something about the kind of silence that could press down on a man until it reshaped him. He carried the box back to the cabin, setting it carefully on the warped table beside the wedding invitation. The contrast was stark. One was a beginning, two people stepping into a shared future. The other was a relic, the record of someone who had already walked the lonely path Ethan now found himself on. He sat there for a long time, not opening the notebook again, just letting the weight of it sit with him. Oddly, it didn't feel heavier than it should. If anything, there was a strange steadiness to be found in those few lines he'd read. Proof that someone else had stood guard here before him, wrestling with the same shadows, enduring the same empty nights, and yet still leaving something behind for the next man. His eyes drifted back to the tower through the open doorway. Harris had stood there once, maybe in the exact same place Ethan was sitting now. Maybe this wasn't just a ruin. Maybe it was still serving its purpose. The thought was small, almost fragile, but it glowed in him all the same. He closed the box, leaving the medal and the photograph where they were, and rested a hand on the worn leather of the notebook. "If you stayed," he said quietly into the empty room, "maybe I can too." Outside, Valor shifted in his stall, the sound of hoof against wood steady and unhurried. The fire in the pit had burned down to embers, and through the trees, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it a faint echo of the words on the page. "We understand." And that's enough. The first light of morning spilled thin and gold across the clearing. Ethan stood in the doorway of the cabin, the chill air pressing against his skin like cool water. Beyond the open space, the tree line still held the last traces of dawn mist, pale and slow-moving between the trunks. Valor stood in the corner of his stall, chewing steadily at a pile of hay, his head lifting once in a silent, almost ceremonial greeting. Ethan drew in a deep breath, letting the cold fill his lungs, the smell of pine and damp earth anchoring him to the present. His fingers tightened around the worn leather cover of the journal, Harris's journal, its weight both literal and symbolic in his hand. Last night, reading those sparse, unflinching words, something had shifted. He could no longer see this place as just a ruin waiting to collapse into the soil. It had survived decades. If Harris could keep it alive through storms, winters, and solitude, then maybe Ethan could too. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to stand. He started with the obvious, the filth. The cabin's floor was hidden beneath layers of dust leaves and brittle remains of small animals that had crawled in to die over the years. The air inside was thick, the stale smell clinging to his clothes. Ethan pulled on a pair of gloves and began shoveling the mess into heavy trash sacks. Each scoop sent a cloud of dust swirling into the sunlight, streaming through the broken panes, catching in his throat, until he coughed hard enough to bend double. By midday, he had carried the first load to the rear of the clearing and set it alight in a shallow pit, the flames licking at the refuse as if eager to erase it. Then came the barn. The floor was littered with old manure, chunks of fallen plaster, and splintered wood. He worked methodically, hauling the debris into a growing pile outside the muscles in his back, nodding under the effort. Valor was turned out into the sun, standing loose, with his head low, ears twitching lazily toward the sound of Ethan's boots crunching through straw. When the worst of the mess was gone, Ethan fetched what little hay was still usable and spread it across the cleared stall floor. He tested the old tie post and found it rotted through, so he replaced the rope with a newer section he'd salvaged from his gear. He patted Valor's neck, voice low. "We'll get you a real roof soon enough, partner." The cabin's walls were next. Close inspection revealed what the eye missed at first glance: slender tunnels of rot running through the board's edges, crumbling where the wind had worn them thin. In some places, you could see daylight right through the gaps. Behind the barn, he found a stash of planks leaning against a collapsed shed, their surfaces weathered, but still solid. They would do. He spent the afternoon cutting them to size and hammering them over the worst holes. The hammer's head was chipped, the handle worn smooth by hands long gone, but it held together under the repeated blows. Each strike echoed through the quiet clearing, a sound almost musical in its rhythm. As he worked, Harris's words returned unbidden. "The greatest enemy of a watchman isn't the bullet, it's the rot." Ethan paused, looking at the wall in front of him. It wasn't just wood he was repairing. It was something else entirely, something that had been wearing away inside him quietly for years. The roof would be harder. From the ground, he could see where entire sections of corrugated tin had peeled back, curling upward like dead leaves. In the next heavy rain, or worse snow, the place would be soaked through. He dug out an old ladder, leaning in the shadows of the barn. One leg was cracked near the base, but with a few nails and a brace of rope, it would hold long enough to get him up there. A small pile of salvaged tin sheets lay in the shed, red with rust, but intact. He carried them up in pairs, each climb a test of balance and patience. The wind cut across the treetops, tugging at his jacket, threatening to shove him sideways. More than once he slipped his boots, scraping against the metal with a hollow screech. But he caught himself each time. He worked until the light faded, then rose again the next day and did it all over. By the time he hammered the last panel into place, the sun was sliding low over the ridge. He stayed where he was for a moment, standing atop the patched roof, looking down over the clearing. From up here, the forest seemed endless, rising and falling like a green ocean, the peaks beyond it holding the last gold of the day. Something in him loosened. It was small, fleeting, but undeniable. The feeling that he had pushed back against whatever had been swallowing him. In the quiet that followed, he noticed something else. When his hands were busy, his mind stopped its endless replay of the past. The sounds that haunted him, rotors chopping the air, the sharp metallic bark of rifles, the shouts in a language half-learned, faded into the background. All he heard now was the rasp of a saw through wood, the ring of hammer on nail, the steady breath of a horse standing close enough that he could feel its warmth at his back. The work became a kind of moving meditation. Every cut, every measured swing of the hammer pulled him further into the present, into a space where his body's exhaustion left no room for ghosts. He wasn't a patient anymore, not here. He was a builder, a caretaker. The cabin and barn weren't ruins, they were raw material. Even the tasks he didn't yet understand, like the structural diagrams in the back of Harris's journal, became challenges to meet. He studied them in the evening by lantern light, tracing the lines with his finger, and then rising in the morning to put them into practice. By the end of the third day, the change was visible. The cabin was cleared of its worst decay. The patched walls no longer whistled in the wind. The roof, though mismatched and scarred, kept the light from breaking through. The barn smelled of fresh straw instead of years-old rot. And Valor's stall was a place he could stand in comfort. Ethan sat on the front step that evening, a steaming tin mug in his hands. He'd boiled the coffee over a small fire pit in the yard, the bitter scent mixing with a sharper bite of pine on the air. Valor stood nearby, free of rope or tether, tearing mouthfuls from a small pile of hay. The sound was slow and even grounding in its own way. Twilight bled into the clearing, the mist rising again from the damp earth, but Ethan didn't feel the cold the way he had before. He reached out, pressing his palm to the smooth, cool boards he'd nailed into place that morning. Beyond them, the watchtower loomed its top platform, sagging one corner gone entirely. It was a bigger job than the cabin or barn, maybe bigger than he could manage. But the thought didn't daunt him the way it might have a week ago. One section at a time. He sipped the coffee, the warmth moving down into him, slow and steady. As long as my hands hold and my heart stays in it, he said quietly to the boards, to the trees, to the journal waiting inside, I'll keep going. The clearing said nothing back. But the wind in the pines shifted, softening for just a moment. And Valor lifted his head, as if in agreement. The morning began under a heavy sky. Ethan was out in the yard, bent over a sawhorse with a length of pine balanced across it, the handsaw rasping back and forth in steady strokes. He was cutting the boards that would become the new barn doors, sturdy weatherproof, built to swing wide enough for Valor to pass without grazing his flanks. The horse was lying down a few yards away, sun-warmed, and still his sides rising and falling with slow, even breaths. It was one of those rare moments in the forest when everything was quiet enough to hear the creak of the trees as they leaned into the wind. Then the sound came low, mechanical, alien against the wilderness. Ethan straightened. A vehicle maybe a half-mile off, moving along the narrow dirt track that wound its way up toward the old station. The saw stilled in his hands. His pulse ticked up a reflex he no longer tried to fight. A silver SUV emerged from between the pines and rolled through the open gate. It stopped in the middle of the clearing tires, crunching over frost-hardened mud. The driver's door opened first. Maya stepped out, gray medical jacket zipped to her chin, hair twisted into a no-nonsense bun, and the faint shadows under her eyes, hinting at too many overnight shifts. She closed the door gently, scanning the yard before her gaze found him. Luke followed from the passenger side. His shirt was crisp, collar stiff. Dark leather shoes that had no business in a place where dirt and pine needles were the flooring. Ethan felt the sigh before he let it out. He hadn't called them. He hadn't asked for anyone to come. So who Ralph, maybe the old mechanic, had a way of noticing things Ethan thought he was keeping to himself. Valor, sensing the shift in his posture, was already on his feet. The horse walked over, stopping just behind Ethan's shoulder head, turned toward the strangers in quiet appraisal. Maya started forward slowly, her boots making soft prints in the thin crust of frost. "Dad, I've been calling." "You didn't answer." Her voice was careful, testing the air between them. "We were worried." Ethan nodded once, his expression giving away nothing more than politeness. "Signal's weak out here." And I didn't figure there was much to say. Luke came to stand a few steps behind her. His eyes swept over the yard, lingering on the unfinished roofline of the tower, the planks stacked in uneven piles, the scuffed earth where Ethan had been cutting. "This place," he began, but whatever thought he'd had seemed to dry up before it reached the air. Ethan stepped back from the sawhorse, motioning toward the cabin. "Come on inside. It's warmer." The interior wasn't luxury by any stretch. Pine boards still raw, where he'd replaced the wall panels, the furniture, a mismatched collection of salvaged chairs, and a table he'd built himself. But it was clean dry and warmed by the small iron stove he'd restored to working order. Maya perched on one of the armless wooden chairs, glancing around at the bare rafters, the shelves lined with tools and jars of nails. Her mouth tightened in a way she probably didn't notice. "Dad," she began after a moment, "this isn't a way to live. No electricity, no running water, no medical care, no one nearby." Ethan leaned back in his chair, hands loose in his lap. "I've got clean air. I've got trees. I've got work to keep me moving. And more important than all that, I've got quiet." Luke shifted his weight impatience, creeping into his stance. "We're trying to get your VA paperwork moving. But if they find out you're living like this in an abandoned ranger station, they're going to flag you as unstable." Ethan's jaw tightened. He took a breath before answering. "I'm not unstable. I'm healing. Just not the way you do it." Maya reached across the table, her fingers curling around his. "You need a doctor, Dad. Medication, not a hammer and a pile of rotting boards." His gaze didn't waver. No doctor ever walked a perimeter in the dark, listening for footsteps. No doctor ever had to hold a place until morning came. "These boards, they have a voice. You just have to know how to listen." Luke's voice came sharper this time. "So what fixing up this place is going to cure you? It's not going to change the diagnosis. You still have PTSD. You're still depressed." Ethan's tone stayed level. "It's not about changing the diagnosis. It's about changing the way I live with it." Maya's voice caught. "You think we don't want you better, I know you do," he said softly. "But what's best for me doesn't look like what you're used to." Luke stepped closer, frustration starting to overtake concern. "You're in the middle of nowhere with a horse. No power, no doctors. You call this therapy. Sounds more like you're just hiding from the world." Ethan didn't answer right away. The pause stretched long enough that even Valor, just outside the window, let out a low, curious whinny. Finally, Ethan spoke slow and deliberate. "Running away is when you turn your back on something. I'm facing mine one board, one leak, one broken hinge at a time." No one replied. The quiet thickened until the only sound was the faint clink of Valor's halter as he moved. "Come on," Ethan said finally. "Let me show you what I've been working on." He led them out to the barn. The new gate swung smoothly on its hinges. The patched roofline was tight against the winter sky. Inside, the stall was clean and bedded the makeshift drainage system ready for snowmelt in spring. Maya stepped in far enough to look, then turned away, murmuring to Luke under her breath. It's like watching a kid build a treehouse. The words were low, but not low enough. Ethan's back straightened his voice, losing its warmth. Maybe to you this is nothing. But every board I've set here, every night I've kept the cold out, I've been alive. Really alive for the first time in years. Luke didn't argue. His eyes, though, still held doubt. Maya bit her lip, gaze dropping to the floor. There was no outright dismissal now, but no full belief either. The visit ended sooner than any of them said out loud. "We'll call you soon," Maya said as she zipped her jacket. Ethan nodded. "Drive safe." At the SUV, she hugged him quick, restrained the kind of embrace that holds back more than it gives. "I just want to make sure you're still here." "I am," he murmured. "In every way that matters." Luke shook his hand firm but wordless. Karen, Luke's wife, hadn't come along. Ethan noticed, and the absence said more than any conversation could have. The SUV's tires crunched over the dirt and moss until the sound thinned into nothing. Ethan stayed where he was long after the forest swallowed them again. Only when the wind moved through the pines, erasing the last trace of the engine's hum, did he turn back toward the cabin. The rest of the afternoon slid by without shape. He didn't go back to the sawhorse, didn't climb the ladder to the half-finished roof. Instead, he sat on the porch steps, at elbows on his knees, watching the light shift through the branches. Valor grazed nearby tail, flicking against the occasional fly, but his eyes came to Ethan now and again, as if to check that he was still there. He thought about Maya's words, Luke's look. He wasn't angry, not really. More hollow. They had come all this way to see him, yet somehow they hadn't seen him at all. By nightfall, the cold was settling in hard. Ethan lit the stove, the flames catching quick on the dry kindling. He pulled a small notebook from the shelf, a new one untouched until now, and sat at the table. Day. They came. They didn't understand. But I can't blame them. There was a time I didn't understand myself either. He closed the book and set it aside. From the open doorway, the barn was just visible in the moonlight, and the line of Valor's back rising above the stall boards. "We'll keep going," Ethan said quietly into the stillness. "Not for them, for us." The horse shifted the leather of his halter, creaking, and for a moment it felt like agreement. The morning air was sharp, laced with the faint bite of wood smoke. Ethan was on his knees by the hearth, working a length of pine across a handsaw to cut replacement boards for the fireplace base. The cold made the metal blade ring with each stroke, a dry rhythm that echoed off the bare cabin walls. Somewhere behind him, Valor shifted in the paddock, and the sound of hooves in frost-crusted dirt carrying through the quiet. From the north trail came movement, slow measured. Ethan looked up. A figure was emerging from the pale veil of mist that hung between the pines. The man wore a scuffed leather jacket and a faded ball cap pulled low over his brow. In one hand, he carried a walking stick. Nothing store-bought, just a length of pine stripped and shaped by a pocket knife. His stride was steady, unfazed by the uneven ground. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he raised a hand in greeting before speaking. "Hope I'm not intruding. Been seeing smoke out of the old station's chimney these last few days. Figured somebody had moved in." Ethan set the saw down, but didn't straighten all the way, still balanced between caution and welcome. "Just an old hand looking for a place to live again," he said. The man's mouth twitched into a half-smile. "Ralph Jennings. Live about 3 miles west over the ridge. This place used to be a signal station. Back in the day, I fixed more than a few of the Army's generators here." Ethan nodded once. No harm in that kind of history. "Ethan, Ralph's eyes moved slowly across the cabin and yard, not in idle curiosity, but with the quiet precision of someone who knew the bones of a place just by looking at it. He took his time circling toward the barn. Fingers brushed the wall where Ethan had replaced a panel 2 weeks earlier. Pine from the north side of the range, he said almost to himself. Termites haven't had much of a go at it. Frame's still solid. All it needs is patience. For the first time in days, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth lift. I've got less patience than I should, but I've got more time than I know what to do with. Ralph stopped under the eave eyes, tipping up to where Ethan's half-finished roof patch met the original timbers. If you rip out all the rafters, you'll waste half the strength they've got left. But if you know how to brace an A-joint and run the pins through the right angle, you can keep the old structure and it'll hold just as well. Ethan tilted his head. An A-joint. The older man rubbed his chin, studying Ethan the way a tradesman sizes up a new apprentice. Then he nodded to himself. I've got the old schematics and a brace and bit drill in my shop. You want to try it? Ethan didn't answer right away. Accepting help wasn't something he did easily. But Ralph wasn't offering charity, he was speaking in the shared language of work, and that was different. Finally, Ethan gave a short nod. Ralph settled himself on the porch step, without asking, fishing a broken cigar from the inside pocket of his jacket. He lit it with an old Zippo, the flame flaring briefly in the cool air before the smoke began to curl. He didn't ask about Ethan's past. Didn't mention the VA or therapy or diagnoses. Instead, he asked, you planning to fix the whole place up? Or just staying until you find somewhere else? Ethan rested his forearms on his knees. I've got nowhere else to stay. And there's nobody waiting to take me in for good. Ralph's gaze didn't soften, but it deepened. When my wife passed, I rebuilt our house from the foundation up, not to forget her, just to remind myself I could still make something worth standing in. Ethan didn't say anything. Neither did Ralph. The quiet between them wasn't the kind that needed filling. Still got the generator in that storage shed? Ralph asked after a while, jerking his thumb toward the weathered outbuilding. Ethan nodded. It's there. Rusted through. I haven't bothered trying to start it. I can fix it, Ralph said simply. You'll need fresh copper wire and a spark plug. I can loan you the kit to check the internals. If it turns over, you could have lights before the week's out. It wasn't just the promise of electricity, it was the tone, the way Ralph said, we could do this, instead of, you should do this. Ethan felt something unclench in his chest. Ralph slapped a broad, work-calloused hand on his shoulder. A lot of folks think living out here means running away. I see it different. You've got your hands, you've got wood, you've got fire, you're still standing. For the first time since their paths had crossed, Ethan looked him full in the eye. Here was someone who didn't see him as a case file or a cautionary tale. Here was someone who spoke like a man, talking to another man, not a broken thing to be handled with gloves. Ralph stood, hitching his pack higher on his shoulders. I'll go get that drill. Be back in the morning. Ethan inclined his head. Appreciate it. I'm not used to folks offering a hand. Not a hand, Ralph said over his shoulder. A trade. I'll show you how to coax life out of that generator, and you teach me how to work with a horse again. Been years since I've been close to one. As if on cue, Valor appeared at the edge of the paddock, ears pricked forward. He let out a low nicker eyes on the two men. Ethan's smile came easier this time. Deal. Ralph lifted a thumb in approval and turned toward the trail, his figure disappearing back into the trees. The sun was starting its slow drop toward the western ridge, and the cabin's patched roof caught the light in warm bands. For the first time since he'd claimed the place, Ethan didn't feel entirely alone. Late in the afternoon, when the light slanted through the trees in a deep gold, Ethan and Ralph were behind the barn, working on the old storage shed. The structure sat low to the ground, its walls weathered to a dull gray corners, sagging where rot had chewed through. Once, long before Ethan had set foot here, it might have stored ammunition or signal equipment. Now it was little more than warped boards and rusted nails. Ralph was at the door with a handsaw cutting through a hinge so corroded the screws had fused to the wood. Ethan worked in a corner, clearing splinters and broken planks into a wheelbarrow. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. Valor stood just outside the half-open entrance head, poking in every so often like a curious inspector. Every time Ralph's saw screeched, the gelding flicked his ears. Then came the hammer strike, sharp, sudden, louder than the rest. Valor, startled, took a step back, then lunged forward again in a quick, nervous movement. His shoulder brushed the side wall of the shed with more force than a casual nudge. The wall gave way. A section of rotted plank crumbled inward like paper falling to the floor in a puff of dust. Behind it, revealed in the dim light, was something neither man had expected, a thin, box-like compartment built into the wall, hidden behind what was clearly a double panel. Ralph lowered his saw and stepped back. "Well," he said, tilting his head toward the gap, "looks like this place has been holding more than just cobwebs." Ethan moved closer, pulling away the remaining splinters. Inside sat a dented tin box, its surface dulled with decades of dust. He carried it out into the open, set it on an upturned crate, and brushed away the dirt with his sleeve. The lid resisted edges stiff with corrosion, but it yielded at last. The smell hit, first not unpleasant, just old. The kind of scent that clings to cedar chests and forgotten trunks in attic corners, dry wood, faint paper, the barest hint of machine oil. Inside were objects wrapped in yellowed cloth and loose paper. He lifted the first, a photograph, its edges curled. 4 figures stood in front of a park fountain, Ethan in uniform, straight-backed and freshly pressed. Beside him, his then wife, one arm looped around his waist, the other holding a toddler-aged Maya. In the foreground, a baby lay swaddled in a carrier. Luke, impossibly small eyes, closed against the sunlight. Beneath it, a plastic hospital bracelet rested in the bottom seam of the box. The print was faded but still legible. Luke, 2:46 a.m., 6 lbs, 9 Oz. The third item was folded in thirds, the creases worn almost to tearing. Ethan opened it carefully. Wax crayon colors bloomed across the paper: green for grass, blue for sky yellow, for a sun drawn too large for the page. In the center, a stick figure man sat astride a lopsided horse with a bold, crooked caption beneath, "My hero dad. Maya, age 6. Ethan froze. His hands trembled not from weakness, but from the way something long locked away had shifted inside him. The pressure in his chest wasn't pain, not exactly. It was the feeling of armor cracking after years of carrying its weight. Ralph said nothing. He simply stepped back a pace, letting the air settle. Ethan's thumb traced the uneven letters of Maya's handwriting. His vision blurred for a moment, but the tears didn't fall. I used to be a hero, he thought. Not because of the uniform, because someone believed it. He folded the paper back along its worn lines and placed it gently beside the photograph. The emotions didn't explode, they seeped into him like slow, steady heat on a winter night. That evening, the tin box sat on the table beside the wood stove. In the main cabin, the firelight caught the edges of the photo frames, the faint shine of the bracelet. Ethan sat with his hands loosely folded. Valor sprawled just outside the doorway, head resting on his forelegs. The horse's breathing was slow, content. Ralph brewed coffee in a dented percolator and set 2 enamel mugs on the table. He lowered himself into the chair across from Ethan. "Things like that," he said, nodding at the items, "they can knock a man down, or they can stand him back up." Ethan took a slow sip before answering. I used to think memories were weight, something you carried until it bent you in half. Now, he looked down at the bracelet, the crayon drawing. I think they can be the foundation instead. Ralph didn't press, didn't ask for the whole story. He just waited. Ethan's gaze swept the room and the patched walls, the mended roof overhead, the faint hum of the generator they'd coaxed to life for a few hours each night. I want to turn this place into something more, he said finally. Not just somewhere to live. I want it to be a fort of memory, a place to keep the things that once made me strong. Ralph's mouth curved into the barest hint of a smile. Then we're gonna need a nameplate, stainless nails, and a proper plan. Ethan surprised himself by laughing a real laugh, loud enough to bounce off the cabin walls. It had been a long time since a laugh like that had come out of him. By morning, the idea had taken root. Ethan cleared a spot on the table, unrolled a sheet of paper, and began sketching a rough map of the station. And the main cabin, the shed, the barn, the broken watchtower. He marked the main cabin with a small circle and wrote living quarters and memory wall. This would be the heart of the fort, where photographs, letters, and keepsakes would hang in chronological order along one side. The shed, once cleaned and reinforced, would become the memory gallery, a place for military gear, family mementos, and any pieces of history the place itself might yield over time. The watchtower, if they could save it, would be turned into an observation deck, part stargazing post, part journal writing retreat. The barn, of course, would remain Valor's domain. Ethan drew a tiny horsehead icon beside it and scribbled loyal companion quarters. When Ralph came in from checking the generator, he leaned over the table and studied the map. Not a museum, he said finally. Not a guest house. Just a place where living and remembering happen in the same breath. Ethan nodded. Every item gets a plaque, even the small ones. I'm going to write my own story before someone else tries to write it for me. That night, he opened a fresh notebook. Not the one he used for repair notes, but one meant for something deeper. On the first page, he wrote, Day 21. I don't need to become someone new. I just need to remember who I was and learn how to live from there. He closed the notebook and labeled the cover with block letters, Fort Memory Journal. When he told Ralph about the name, the older man grinned. Then you need a sign. Something people can see the second they walk through the gate. The next afternoon, they found a plank of straight-grain pine, planed it smooth, and Ethan set to work with a hand-awl, carving the words letter by letter. Fort Memory. Founded by Ethan Cole, 2025. When it was done, he held it up. The grooves were uneven in places, but the weight of it felt right. They mounted it on the rebuilt front gate. Valor stood beside them, ears forward, tail flicking lazily in the autumn sun. Ethan rested a hand on the gelding's neck as Ralph stepped back to survey their work. 3 figures stood in that clearing, a soldier who'd nearly lost himself, a horse who'd stayed beside him, and a craftsman who'd wandered out of the mist one morning. The fort wasn't finished. The rooms weren't polished, and the gallery wasn't stocked. But the place already had something far more important than completion. It had purpose, and for the first time, Ethan realized the station wasn't a place he'd come to hide. It was where he had chosen to start building a life again. By the first week of November, Montana had shed its autumn colors and wrapped itself in the cold steel of winter. The air cut through every gap in the cabin walls, and even the sunlight seemed brittle, offering no warmth. Ethan knew the season here didn't make allowances. Winter came to claim not to bargain. If the fort was going to hold out, it needed to be ready. He started with the floors. The boards in the main cabin had warped from years of damp and neglect, so he stripped them out and replaced them with tongue-and-groove pine, tight, smooth, and warm underfoot. Ralph, showing up one morning with the faint scent of tobacco and motor oil clinging to his jacket, set down a pair of heavy rolls wrapped in old tarpaulin. Mineral wool insulation, Ralph said. Stuff they used in forward stations works just as well in a cabin. Ethan nodded, hefting the rolls. They were heavier than they looked. For the next week, he worked methodically, packing insulation between the wall studs, sealing the drafts that had been slicing through at night. The next project was heat. From the scrap pile in town, Ethan had salvaged an old cast-iron stove. Heavy rust bloomed its firebox door, hanging askew. It took 3 days of grinding, sanding, and oiling before it looked like it might draw a flame again. Another day to cut and fit the new stovepipe through the patched roof. When the first fire took, the iron turned deep red, and the dry heat filled the room like a living thing. A rack for firewood went up along the south wall, stacked in careful rows. Ralph eyed the neatness of it and smirked. You arrange it like that without inviting people over to admire it? Shameful. Ethan just smiled faintly. He wasn't ready for visitors. Not yet. But for the first time, the thought didn't feel impossible. Once the cabin was sealed and warm, Ethan turned his attention to Valor's comfort. The barn was snug now, its gaps mended, its roof patched, but the yard was still a hazard. Posts rotted at the base, rails splintered. For 3 days, Ethan stripped the bark from aged pine, shaped the bottoms to sit clean in the frozen ground, and set them in place one by one. He found an old chain-link panel in the shed, rusted but intact, worked it into the new fencing. Valor hovered nearby, sometimes nosing the posts as if to check their stability, sometimes standing still and watching the work with those unblinking dark eyes. When the last rail was fastened and the gate hung straight, Ethan carved a small sign and wired it to the entry. Valor's range, comrades' quarters. Ralph snapped a picture with the cracked phone he kept in his jacket. That horse has got a better place than most people I know. Ethan brushed wood shavings from his gloves. He's pulled me out of worse than snowdrifts. Time to return the favor. Snow had just begun to gather at the edges of the paddock, softening the lines of the fence. And for a moment, the scene looked less like survival and more like peace. The last of the big repairs was the watchtower. It leaned slightly west, as if the years had pushed it that way, and some of the steps were little more than splinters held together by nails. Ethan and Ralph studied the base, marked the worst sections, and began the slow work of bringing it back. They poured crude footings from cement mixed with gravel from the hillside, driving steel rods into the corners for bracing. Ralph handled the tension wires, stringing them high and taut to anchor the structure against winter storms. Ethan took to the stairs, cutting new treads, fitting them to the old risers joining the beams, with hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. 2 weeks later, they stood on the upper platform, new railings firm beneath their hands. The wind was sharp but clean up here, carrying the scent of pine and the faint creak of the wires, holding the tower steady. 20 feet higher than your roof, Ralph said, leaning against the rail, and steadier than most folks' convictions. Ethan looked out. From here, the whole fort was visible. The cabin with its patched roof and lamplight glowing in the window, the neat rectangle of Valor's paddock, and the shed that would soon be the memory gallery. The land was bare and white-edged now, but it was theirs. He took a paint marker from his jacket and wrote across the beam above them, Watch Post Number 1. For those still looking toward the light, it would be his place for reading letters, for writing in the journal, for seeing the storms before they arrived. A high point worth climbing to. The generator had been sitting in the shed, longer than either man wanted to guess, older than 1995, Ralph figured. The casing was pitted with rust and the fuel tank smelled like varnish, and the carburetor might as well have been glued shut with grit. For nearly a week, Ralph dismantled it piece by piece. Ethan built a new frame to mount it on, shored up the bolts, and replace the rotted fuel line. Parts came from everywhere, some from Ralph's workshop, some from the county junkyard, some from an old lawn tractor nobody would miss. On the night of the test run, the two of them stood in the darkened cabin flashlights, throwing long shadows on the walls. Ralph wiped his hands on a rag. If it blows, at least it'll be spectacular. Ethan turned the key. The starter caught for half a second, then died. The second try lasted longer. The engine rattled, choked, then roared into a low, steady rumble. Light flared overhead, warm and golden from the bare bulb in the ceiling. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ralph exhaled. We have power. In Montana. In the middle of nowhere. Ethan sank into a chair, staring at the way Valor's shadow stretched across the wall outside the open door. It wasn't the shadow of emptiness anymore. I didn't think I'd see this again, he said quietly. Ralph clapped a hand to his shoulder. Now you can write letters. Let the world know this place is lit again. In the days that followed, the fort shifted from shelter to home. Curtains went up on the windows. Ethan cut and stitched them himself from surplus army canvas. Chairs were padded with burlap salvaged from old grain sacks. On the wall above the table, he hung the framed photograph from the tin box, the one with Maya and Luke. Ralph arrived one morning carrying a pendulum wall clock that hadn't ticked in years. Won't run, he admitted, but it'll look like it should. Ethan hung it anyway. It kept no time, but its face seemed to watch over the room, steady and familiar. The stove burned hot enough now to boil water for tea while warming the entire cabin. In the evenings, Ethan wrote in the fort memory journal, sometimes about repairs, sometimes about nothing more than the sound of the wind in the trees. The entries came without force, without the weight of obligation. He brushed Valor's coat daily, patched the worn leather of the saddle, and kept the stall clean and dry the bedding fresh. One night, as snow sifted down in the yard and the lamplight glowed soft against the frost-rimmed windows, Ethan stood by the table looking out. The wind pressed against the cabin, but inside was warm, the fire steady, the light unwavering. He smiled, small, genuine. I'm not fighting winter, he thought. I'm living in it. The fort of memory wasn't an idea anymore. It had walls, heat, and light. It had the shape of a life being rebuilt plank by plank, breath by breath. It was a late afternoon in mid-January, the kind of day when the sky stayed a pale gray from dawn until dusk, and the cold seemed to settle into your bones whether you moved or not. Ethan was out by the paddock, checking the fence posts for ice damage, when he heard the familiar growl of Ralph's old pickup crunching through the snow toward the gate. Ralph climbed out slowly, his breath puffing in small clouds, a box of nails tucked under one arm. There was something in his face, half amusement, half something else Ethan couldn't place. He set the box down on the porch, straightened, and said with the offhand air of someone dropping a casual remark that was anything but casual. Old someone a bit about you, Ralph said. Seems they decided to see for themselves. Ethan frowned, but before he could ask who, the sound of another engine drifted in from the road. This one was smoother, newer. Moments later, a silver SUV rolled to a stop just outside the gate, snow and road salt clinging to the wheel wells. The driver's door opened. Luke stepped out, his parka dusted with melting flakes, the hem still damp from where it had brushed past roadside slush. He stood still for a moment, taking in the scene, his eyes moving from the barn to the tower, to the cabin itself. For a long beat, Luke didn't say anything. He just looked. The roof of the main cabin, a deep red, now rose clean against the pale snow, a thin plume of smoke rising straight from the chimney into the cold sky. The front door, refitted and painted a crisp, white-trimmed brown, stood solid against the wind. Beside it, the barn was tidy with a sign hanging over the gate in neat hand-carved letters, Valor's Range. Beyond that, the watchtower stood straight and solid, its glass panes catching the muted glow of the winter sun. Luke's gaze kept moving, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he remembered. When he'd last been here, the place had been a shell drafty, sagging smelling of mildew and disuse. Now, as he stepped onto the porch, it felt like walking into a photograph from one of those rustic lifestyle magazines his wife liked to leave on the coffee table. The floorboards gleamed with a faint polish. The table was hand-built solid pine, matched with chairs padded in rough canvas. The old cast-iron stove radiated steady heat, its stovepipe humming faintly. On the shelves, framed photographs sat alongside small wooden plaques, engraved with dates or names, each telling some fragment of a story. Luke turned to find his father standing in the doorway watching him. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Luke's expression shifted from wariness to something like pride. "I've never seen you like this," Luke said finally, his voice low but clear. "Like you're actually living." Ethan didn't answer with words, just a slight nod and a gesture toward the open door. This time there was no guardedness in his eyes. Inside, Ralph busied himself at the stove filling the kettle. He set 3 mugs on the counter, but once the water was poured and the tea steeping, he picked up his jacket and muttered something about having an urgent matter to attend to in town. He left before either father or son could protest, his boots thudding lightly on the porch and then fading into the sound of his truck starting up. Ethan and Luke sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the cast-iron stove between them and the winter pressing in against the cabin walls. Each had a mug resting on a small wooden coaster. For a while, the conversation stuck to neutral ground: the weather, the snow forecast, Luke's office work. Then Luke glanced around the room again and asked with a kind of hesitant curiosity, "When did you start doing all this?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose, crossed to the sideboard, and returned with the Fort memory journal. He opened it to a section marked with a folded scrap of paper and slid it across the table. Luke leaned forward, reading the neat, blocky handwriting entries describing the floor repair, the insulation work, the barn fencing the watchtower. But the words weren't just about tasks. They carried thoughts, flashes of memory, the quiet victories of a day's honest work. Luke read for a long moment before setting the book down. "I never thought..." He paused, searching for the right phrase. "I never thought writing was how you kept going." Ethan's mouth curved into a faint smile. "I used to think survival meant fighting. Now it's hammering a nail straight, writing a sentence, boiling water. Each one's its own kind of win." Luke didn't smile back, but his eyes softened. The look he gave his father was different this time, not the quick scan of a son checking for signs of stability or relapse, but the steadier gaze of one man seeing another, measuring him not by the past, but by the present. Ethan spoke first about the early days here, the wind cutting through the walls, the dark without power, the narrow comfort of Valor's presence in the paddock. He told Luke about the panic attack on the mountain pass that had nearly sent him back the way he'd come, and how he'd chosen instead to drive the last miles to this place. Luke listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around the mug as though absorbing the warmth. Ethan didn't try to defend himself or justify his decisions. He simply told it as it had been. "I wasn't running away," Ethan said finally. "I was running to the only place I could rebuild the pieces in my head, one at a time." Luke exhaled slowly. "We called this your hermit's bunker. Maya was ready to file some kind of petition with the VA, make them drag you back into town." Ethan chuckled softly. "I knew. But now, What do you see?" Luke's eyes swept the room again, lingered on the photographs, the sturdy furniture, the steady fire. Then he looked back at his father. "I see someone who lost himself and found his way back. Not because of meds or therapy, though maybe those had their place, but because he started living right." Ethan nodded. "Had to build my own base again. No one else could do it for me." They let the silence sit then. It wasn't the brittle, uneasy quiet of old conversations cut short, but something warmer, like two soldiers standing the same watch and finding comfort in not having to fill the air with words. When Luke stood to leave, the daylight had already faded to that deep indigo that comes before full night. He stepped onto the porch and looked toward the barn and the tower, his gaze settling on each detail as though committing it to memory. At the SUV's door, he turned back. "If you don't mind, next weekend I could come back. Bring some of my woodworking tools. Been a while since I worked with a hand plane." Ethan felt the quick, warm spark of joy in his chest, but kept his voice level. "There's always work here for a good pair of hands." Luke nodded, then hesitated. "Thanks, Dad, for not giving up on yourself. Before we even knew we should be worried." Ethan watched him climb into the SUV, the taillights glowing red against the snow. In that moment, he knew something had shifted. The fort was no longer just his. It had begun to open to become a place where not only he could heal, but where misunderstandings could be undone and connections rebuilt. As the sound of the SUV faded into the distance, Ethan stood for a moment in the stillness, the glow of the watchtower windows at his back, the quiet snort of valor from the paddock beside him. For the first time in years, the horizon ahead didn't feel like a place to fear, it felt like a place to walk toward. A week after Luke's visit, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper in front of him. The wind rattled faintly at the eaves, and Valor's steady shifting in the paddock filled the pauses between pen strokes. He wrote slowly, his hand steady enough to keep the lines straight, but not immune to the occasional tremor. Every word was chosen carefully, not because he wanted it to sound elegant, but because he wanted it to sound like him, honest, unvarnished. Saturday, 5:00 p.m. First dinner at Fort Memory. There was a place to sit, a warm fire, and a man learning to be a father again. When he'd finished, he folded the page once and slid it into a plain brown envelope. He addressed it to Maya, Luke, and Karen, the daughter-in-law he'd never met, and left the return space empty. No phone call, no text. Just this one letter. Ralph drove it into town later that morning, tucking it into the outgoing mail slot at the post office with a raised eyebrow and a muttered bold move. Ethan didn't say what he thought, that he wasn't sure they'd come. Instead, he prepared as if they would. Saturday arrived under a sky the color of old pewter snowflakes drifting down like sifted ash. The wind barely stirred just enough to remind him it was January in the mountains. He wore a clean white shirt under a wool coat, and over that the heavy canvas apron Ralph had sewn for him as a joke, but which had somehow become part of his routine. The cast-iron stove was already glowing, the air rich with the scent of venison stew and cornbread baking in the Dutch oven. The table, solid pine built by his own hands, was cleared of tools and dusted until the grain caught the lamplight. He'd laid a red and white checkered cloth across it and set a jar of dried wildflowers in the center. Out in the paddock, Valor's coat gleamed from a fresh brushing. The stall was lined with clean straw, and a bucket of apples and carrots waited nearby. The watchtower was lit from the inside, its windows throwing soft rectangles of gold against the snow. The cabin itself glowed in the twilight, a small beacon in the endless white. When the crunch of tires on snow came from the road, Ethan stepped outside but didn't hurry. The silver SUV rolled to a stop at the gate. Maya stepped out first, pulling her scarf tighter. Luke emerged from the driver's side with a smile that was more certain than the one he'd worn the week before. Then came Karen, short, dark-haired, with eyes that took everything in at once. She looked from the tower to the barn to the smoke rising from the chimney and murmured, "This doesn't look isolated at all." Ethan met her eyes, nodded once, and swung the gate open. He didn't explain. He just led them inside. The four of them sat around the table with the warmth of the fire on their faces and Valor shifting quietly outside the window. The room carried the layered smell of wood smoke, bread, and slow-cooked meat. Ethan ladled the stew into bowls, explaining almost shyly that he'd learned the recipe from an old field manual he'd found in a box of military gear. Karen grinned. This should be in some kind of frontier master chef competition. The joke landed. Maya laughed a real laugh, unforced, and Luke shook his head with a grin. The sound was warmer than Ethan remembered from their last awkward meal together months ago. At first, Maya's gaze carried that quiet measurement he knew too well, her hands folded in front of her on the table. But little by little, she leaned in, resting one hand lightly on the tablecloth, her fingertips tapping to the rhythm of the conversation. Luke asked about the watchtower rebuild. Karen pointed to an old lantern hanging in the corner and asked, "Does that still work?" "No," Ethan said. "But I kept it. Some things don't need to shine anymore to mean something." They ate until the bowls were empty, and in the firelight, Ethan could see the difference in their faces, less guarded, more present. When the dishes were stacked and the plates wiped down, Ethan stood and said quietly, "I want to show you something, but only if you're ready to see it." He led them to a door at the back of the cabin. The wood above the frame had been carved with careful, deliberate letters, "Fort Memory Room, for what remains." Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs, some framed, some tacked directly to the wood. There was a picture of all of them when Luke was still a boy, Ethan in uniform, Maya grinning with a missing tooth. On one wall hung a small, wrinkled piece of paper, a crayon drawing of a stick-figure soldier wearing a helmet. Above it, in the uneven scrawl of a 5-year-old hand, were the words, "My Hero Dad." Beside it, in a shadow box, lay a tiny hospital wristband with Luke printed in fading ink. Below that, folded with precise military corners, was an American flag, the one presented to him after the funeral of a friend who had never come home. Maya stood still, her hand trembling slightly, before she reached to touch the glass over the drawing. "I thought you didn't keep anything, that you didn't want to remember." "I lost my direction," Ethan said. "Not my memory." Luke stepped closer and put a hand on his father's shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner." Karen stepped back, giving them space. The three of them embraced an awkward, halting thing at first, then tighter, steadier. No one said the word forgive. It wasn't needed. The gesture was enough. They returned to the kitchen where the tea still steamed in the pot, and the cornbread sat in a pan, its edges crisp. Maya, wiping at her eyes with the heel of her hand, said, "I've got a week off in June. Is there a trail up here that leads to a valley?" Ethan nodded. "Raven Hill Lookout. From there you can see the whole park." Luke's eyes lit. "If you've got a spare saddle, I'd like to ride Valor for the first time." Karen laughed. "I'll walk with Maya, but if someone cooks like this, I'll carry the cooler." Ethan raised his mug. "Then this summer, Fort Memory will have its first family camp, if you're willing to pitch a tent." They all laughed, and Ethan realized something quietly profound. Family didn't have to come back the same as before. It could be built new, board by board, moment by moment. By the time the SUV rolled away from the gate, the sky had deepened to violet, and the first stars had begun to glint through the thinning clouds. Ethan watched the taillights fade, then turned toward the watchtower. He climbed slowly, feeling the slight give of the steps under his weight, but also their steadiness. Valor watched from below his breath, fogging in the cooling air. From the top, the world spread out in every direction, snow blanketing the forest, the horizon painted in gold and rose by the setting sun. The tracks from their boots still patterned the snow between the cabin and the barn. The window of the memory room caught the sunset and sent it back in a soft glow. The mountain wind slipped past him, teasing his hair, carrying that sharp, clean cold that meant you were alive to feel it. Ethan rested his hands on the rail and whispered, "Thank you for what's left." Below, Valor let out a quiet nicker as if answering. Somewhere on a nearby post, the small camera Ralph had mounted clicked the timer, catching the moment. In the photograph, Ethan stood on the tower with Valor at its base, the sky behind them fading into night, the last light of day, wrapping them both in gold. Months later, the picture would hang in the memory room in a plain wooden frame. Beneath it, a small handwritten note would read, "The first day of the rest."
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.